The auditorium fell into a hush. The instant little Grace Thompson's final note drifted into silence. Margaret Thompson, her single mother, felt her heart seize as she gripped the edge of her folding chair, praying the floor wouldn't give way beneath her. No applause followed Grace's gentle bow. No murmured well done. No rustling of programs to break the dead air, just an uneasy stillness that pressed in on them both. Then came the whisper from someone behind them. "That's the poor girl. You know, the one her mom raises all on her own." Margaret's chest tightened. Her cheeks flushed with shame, and she wanted nothing more than to sprint onto the stage and scoop Grace up in her arms. But Grace stayed poised at the piano, her small hands still trembling over the keys hands that had spent countless nights pouring hope and longing into a $60 keyboard she'd found at a yard sale. At 9 years old, Grace had crafted an original melody that felt as tender as a summer rain and as aching as missing someone you love. Margaret had watched her daughter retreat into music night after night, coaxing beauty from worn white keys and showing a bravery beyond her years. Now, under the glare of the stage lights, Grace stood alone, vulnerable yet unwavering. In that charged silence, Margaret realized this performance was more than a recital. It was Grace's bold declaration, "I belong here, and my voice matters," just as Margaret braced herself for defeat. A lone figure in a tailored navy suit in the back row rose to his feet, setting the stage for a moment neither of them would ever forget. Margaret Thompson felt as if the walls of the school auditorium were closing in on her the moment she heard those two cruel words. She sat rooted to her folding chair, her knuckles whitening around the cold metal frame as the hush that followed her daughter's final piano chord morphed into something far darker. "That's the poor girl," someone whispered. "The one her mom raises all on her own." The words cut through the silence like gravel under a truck tire, rattling Margaret's spine and sending a flush of humiliation flooding her cheeks. She glanced sideways at 9-year-old Grace, whose small frame stood poised at the piano bench like a fragile bird, hands still trembling against the ivory keys as if she didn't yet believe her song had ended. Grace's eyes flicked toward her mother, searching, pleading for some sign of reassurance. But Margaret felt frozen, caught between fury at the rude observer and heartbreaking empathy for her daughter's sudden flush of shame. Just weeks earlier, Margaret had watched Grace discover her $60 yard sale keyboard in their modest living room, marveling as the child coaxed from scratched white keys a melody that spoke of rain-soaked sidewalks and the ache of longing. Now, in this crowded room under the harsh glare of fluorescent stage lights, that melody floated into an atmosphere so heavy with judgment that it threatened to smother every fragile note of Grace's confidence. Parents in designer coats and polished loafers exchanged knowing glances, while a few students stifled giggles behind their hands. A judge in a crisp blazer checked his phone, and another shuffled papers as though eager to move on. The auditorium's usual supportive buzz merely polite applause. Cursory claps had evaporated entirely, replaced by a cold, expectant silence that seemed to question whether Grace had any right to be there at all. Margaret's mind raced. She could taste the metal tang of panic in her mouth, feel her heart hammering in her throat like a trapped bird. She wanted to shout, to leap to her feet and challenge everyone who dared reduce her daughter's art to a punchline about single parents. But fear rooted her body in place, the fear of making a scene. The fear of exposing their already vulnerable status, the fear that Grace would crumble if her mother made her moment about anything but her music. Instead, Margaret sat motionless, her every nerve strung tight with helplessness. She hated the sway of her own breath, the way her chest constricted whenever Grace's head bowed, as though the child carried the weight of that whispered insult all on her slender shoulders. Yet even in that suffocating atmosphere, there was something beautiful unfolding Grace's unwavering commitment to her composition. As the final chord lingered, a delicate, unresolved whisper that seemed to hold all her bravery and hope, Grace remained at the keyboard. Her posture still regaled despite the tangible hostility around her. The hush that had once felt oppressive transformed, in that moment, into a testament to her courage. She refused to let judgment silence her voice. Margaret's heart swelled with pride so fierce it threatened to burst through her rib cage. Here was her daughter, standing tall in a room that would rather ignore her, wielding her music like a beacon against shame. It was then that Margaret understood something profound. The cruelty of a whispered stereotype could sting, but it could never define Grace's worth or the value of her music, even if the world refused to applaud. Grace's melody had already been heard where it mattered most, in her mother's unwavering love and in the quiet determination etched on her own face. With that realization, Margaret felt the first tremor of calm wash through her, and she vowed that no offhand remark would ever steal her daughter's joy or her own belief in what Grace could become. In that charged moment of silent defiance, mother and daughter shared an unspoken promise they would keep playing, keep dreaming, and keep rising above every whispered doubt. Margaret Thompson's chest tightened as she sat rigidly in the auditorium, unable to move a muscle or speak a word. All around her, folding chairs creaked and whispered under the weight of restless parents and excited children. But Margaret felt nothing except the cool metal of her seat pressing into her palms, anchoring her in place. She had come to watch her 9-year-old daughter, Grace, perform a piece she'd written herself, an original melody born from late nights at home, coaxed out of a battered $60 keyboard. Instead, Margaret found herself at the epicenter of an ice-cold hush, broken only by the faintest whisper, "That's the poor girl, the one her mom raises all on her own." Instantly, the auditorium's usual murmur of polite applause had vanished. The soft echo of Grace's final piano chord lingered in the air, unresolved and delicate, as if Grace herself had left it lingering on the edge of something more, when Grace bowed, as Margaret had taught her. Neither the students nor the judges offered even a polite clap. Even a few scattered coughs felt routine compared to the deliberate silence that greeted her daughter. Margaret's heart lurched. She wanted to leap forward, to sweep Grace into her arms and run from those unforgiving lights and judgmental stares. But her body betrayed her. Her legs remained locked beneath her, her fingers clenching the chair's armrest so tightly she could taste the metal. She remembered the countless evenings they'd spent together in their small living room. While Margaret scrubbed desks and emptied trash cans by day, Grace would curl up beside her, humming fragments of a song into an old voice recorder. When Margaret came home from her late shift at the diner, usually just before midnight, Grace would press her small face into Margaret's shoulder and play those humming notes on her secondhand keyboard. "Mama," Grace would say softly, "this one feels like rain." And Margaret would rest a gentle hand on her daughter's back, struck by the raw emotion in those simple bars of music. Now, as the harsh stage lights revealed every anxious flicker in Grace's posture, Margaret fought back tears. She knew what those whispered words meant. They reduced her daughter's talent to a punchline about their modest circumstances. She could feel her own cheeks burn with shame and anger. But more than anything, she felt a crushing helplessness. If she stood up to defend Grace, She feared she would only draw more attention to their single-parent status, confirming every prejudice those neighbors had about women raising children alone. And yet, watching Grace stand there so bravely, refusing to let the silence eclipse her worth, Margaret felt an overwhelming need to protect her. For a moment, time slowed. Margaret noticed the way Grace's fingers still trembled over the keys, as though each note carried the weight of her hopes and fears. She watched Grace's head dip into a graceful bow, eyes lifted only long enough to find Margaret's gaze. In that brief eye contact, Margaret sensed her daughter's confusion, an unspoken question of why the world would turn away instead of celebrating her gift. It was a question Margaret wanted more than anything to answer. But the auditorium remained unmoved. The next act of the talent show began its own fanfare, flashy dance routines with bright costumes and booming music. Parents leaned forward, phones raised. Judges smiled and jotted down notes. Margaret felt as though she and Grace had been erased from the program. And yet, in the midst of that erasure, Margaret discovered a quiet strength. She realized that Grace's courage to perform despite knowing she might be judged was itself a triumph. At that moment, Margaret made a silent promise she would never let Grace believe that her worth depended on an audience's approval. She would remind her daughter that true art shines brightest in the face of indifference, and when the final notes of the dance routine faded, Margaret stood and slipped backstage, determined to envelop Grace in a hug that spoke more loudly than any applause ever could. In the shadows behind the curtain, Margaret finally found her voice soft but unwavering as she whispered, "You were perfect out there. Sweetheart, don't ever forget how brave you are." In that powerless moment, when everyone else looked away, Margaret learned that love's quiet power can carry far more weight than whispered insults or empty seats. And as she held Grace close, she knew that together, mother and daughter would turn this day's sting into the fuel for Grace's next song, one that no silence could silence. Margaret Thompson felt every heartbeat echo like a thunderclap in the hush of the auditorium as she watched her daughter, 9-year-old Grace, stand alone at the piano bench, her small frame illuminated by the unforgiving glare of the stage lights and her trembling fingers poised above the keys. In that moment, Margaret's heart constricted with a mixture of pride, fear, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Pride for the courage her daughter displayed in sharing an original composition crafted on a $60 yard sale keyboard. Fear that this vulnerable moment would be overshadowed by the harsh judgment of strangers, and helplessness because she, a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep their modest household afloat, the first as a janitor at the local middle school during the day, and the second serving midnight diners in a highway cafe, could not leap to her feet and shield Grace from the silent disdain surrounding them. She clenched the edge of her metal folding chair so tightly that her knuckles whitened. Knuckles that had scrubbed countless desks and wipe-smudged cafeteria tables, and yet in this very seat, she felt powerless. The only sound aside from the piano's final note was the whisper of a critic in the back row. "That's the poor girl, the one her mom raises on her own," and it cut deeper than any overt heckle. Margaret remembered the countless nights spent coaxing out melodies with Grace at their kitchen table, the way her daughter's eyes would light up in the soft glow of the lamp as she hummed tentative bars into her phone's voice recorder. "This one feels like rain," she had said once, tracing damp patterns on the window at home as a summer storm rolled past. And Margaret had nodded, wrapping a hand around her daughter's small shoulder, marveling at the way music could carry the weight of a child's longing and hope. Yet now, in this crowded room of cashmere coats and polished loafers, that very gift was met with indifference and covert cruelty. Every attempt Margaret made to swallow the lump in her throat failed. She wanted to call out, to remind the audience that art knows no economic class, that talent cannot be measured by the seams of a dress or the shine of a school backpack. But as she looked at Grace's bowed head, she remembered how they'd practiced together, learning the gentle art of resilience, how to accept polite applause but not depend on it. She recalled teaching Grace to hold her posture steady even when her voice cracked during recitals, to lift her chin when the world tried to look past her. And so Margaret remained seated, embracing her own fear that a public outburst would only add the humiliation of being that mother, and instead resolved to show Grace her support in the quietest, most steadfast way she knew, by keeping her place at the edge of that audience, by holding her breath until the last chord faded, and by offering a brave smile that said, "I see you, and your music matters." In that stillness, every pang of helplessness was transmuted into resolve, a promise that no whispered stereotype would ever define Grace's worth. And though the auditorium may have remained silent, Margaret knew that her daughter's song had already resonated within the safest, most powerful space there was the unspoken bond between a mother and her child, a space where love and belief in one another drown out even the sharpest edges of neglect. Margaret Thompson's heart lurched the moment she noticed him a solitary figure in the back row, rising from his seat as though propelled by an invisible purpose. All afternoon, the auditorium had hummed with polite applause, and the rustle of programs a backdrop of comforting murmurs for the annual school talent show. But when 9-year-old Grace finished her original piano piece, the expected claps never came. Instead, a brittle silence fell over the room, broken only by the faint click of a whisper. "That's the poor girl." Margaret felt the weight of those words settle on her shoulders like a lead blanket, even as she stared at her daughter's bowed head, fingers poised too long on the last key. Just then, from the very rear of the hall, a man in a tailored gray suit stood. At first, Margaret thought it must be a school official, someone late to the event, until she noticed the deliberate calm in his movement. He didn't fumble for his program or glance around nervously. Instead, he drew a slow, purposeful breath and began to walk down the center aisle. Chairs scraped under shifting bodies, and a ripple of startled whispers spread through the crowd. "Who is that? Isn't the next act a duet? What's going on?" The judges paused, exchanged puzzled glances, and parents lifted their phones, some to record, others to confirm their confusion. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, imagining stepping in front of that man and protecting Grace from the harsh glare. But something about his stride steady, unhurried, unguarded made her relax just enough to watch. He moved with quiet confidence, hands clasped behind his back, head level, eyes fixed on the stage. There was no arrogance in him, only a resolute kindness that seemed to part the oppressive hush like a ship cutting through a still lake. Grace, standing at the edge of the spotlight, looked up when she sensed movement behind her. Her small shoulders hunched instinctively, as if bracing for another cruel whisper. But this time, her gaze didn't lock with a sneer. It found something hopeful. Margaret felt a tear slip down her cheek, not of sorrow, but of relief. Here was someone who cared enough to break the silence. As the man reached the foot of the stage, the auditorium stilled completely. Even the youngest performers watching from the wings pressed their faces to the curtains. Margaret leaned forward, willing her legs to move, ready to stand up, but uncertain whether she should or not. The man paused, turned to face the judge's table, and raised a single hand in a polite greeting, though no words had yet been spoken. His presence spoke volumes. He was here to change the narrative. In that pregnant pause, Margaret realized that sometimes courage doesn't roar. Sometimes it's a solitary figure rising in the back of the room, refusing to stay silent in the face of indifference. Grace's song, its gentle arpeggios and unexpected, haunting pauses had called for acknowledgement, and this stranger had answered. Margaret's chest swelled with gratitude as she watched him reach for the microphone, ready to give her daughter's music the respect it had so long deserved. And in that moment, as the stranger turned toward the audience to speak, Margaret knew nothing would ever be the same for Grace, for herself, or for anyone who witnessed a single act of bravery in a hall too accustomed to silence. The world had finally listened. Dr. Elias Monroe stood at the foot of the stage for only a moment before addressing the hushed crowd, but in that brief span, his presence alone shifted the entire atmosphere, clad in a well-tailored navy suit. He cleared his throat with calm authority and lifted the microphone. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice warm yet firm. "My name is Dr. Elias Monroe, and I teach piano at the Juilliard School in New York City." A murmur rippled through the audience. Juilliard was a name most had only encountered in glossy magazine profiles or on classical music broadcasts. Yet here, local parents and students found themselves leaning forward, suddenly attentive. Dr. Monroe paused just long enough for the silence to deepen, then continued. "I wasn't originally scheduled to speak tonight. My flight home was canceled, so I came to see my granddaughter perform." He cast a gentle glance toward the side wing of the stage where 9-year-old Grace Thompson stood clutching her sheet music. "But when I heard that child's composition," he said, "I knew I couldn't just sit quietly." A few stifled gasps echoed through the auditorium. Margaret Thompson, sitting in the third row, felt her heart tighten as she watched this distinguished gentleman turn the spotlight back onto her daughter. Dr. Monroe's next words were simple, yet their impact was monumental. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you just heard was an original work, every note, every phrase, crafted by Grace herself." He nodded toward Grace, who blinked in surprise. "That kind of creativity," he went on, "that honest, soulful expression is rare at any age, much less from someone so young." A parent near the back pressed a hand over her mouth. Even the judges who earlier had glanced down at their phones sat bolt upright, pens forgotten on clipboards. Then Dr. Monroe made his invitation. "With your permission, Grace, would you play your composition once more this time? May I accompany you?" The request was offered with such respect that Grace's hesitant nod seemed to fill the room with hope. As she returned to the piano bench, Dr. Monroe joined her, not commandeering the instrument, but sharing the seat so their elbows brushed lightly as they settled in. He positioned his hands above the lower keys, ready to provide gentle harmonic support. When Grace's small fingers touched the ivory once again, the melody unfolded with renewed depth. Dr. Monroe's chords, firm yet unobtrusive, formed a soft cushion beneath her tune, allowing each note to resonate fully. It was as though he had given her composition a pair of wings, lifting it into the very rafters of the auditorium. Parents sat forward, some with tears in their eyes. Neighbors who had whispered, "Poor girl," just moments before now exchanged looks of genuine admiration. The very air seemed to vibrate with collective wonder. By the time they reached the final chord, a tender, Suspended resonance that Dr. Monroe held until it faded, the audience had been transformed. What had begun as an indifferent assembly of busy families became a single body united in applause. Phones emerged to capture the moment. Even the sternest judge offered an enthusiastic standing ovation. For Grace, the experience was nothing short of magical. She turned to Dr. Monroe with a shy but radiant smile, and he responded with a grandfather's pride, a slight nod, eyes moist with emotion. Back in her seat, Margaret felt tears prick her eyelids as she watched the judges rise to their feet. In that instant, she knew that her daughter's talent had been validated in the most profound way, a confirmation not just of skill, but of worth. Dr. Monroe's invitation had done more than showcase Grace's music. It had reminded everyone that creativity, when met with kindness and encouragement, can flourish even in the most unlikely places. And for Grace, it marked the beginning of a journey far beyond this small Indiana school auditorium, one where her original voice would continue to be heard, one note at a time. When Dr. Elias Monroe settled onto the piano bench beside 9-year-old Grace Thompson and guided his hands over the lower keys, something extraordinary happened. The timid melody that had once stood alone like a single raindrop suddenly became a sweeping rainstorm of sound. Grace lifted her small hands with newfound confidence, each note resonating more fully against Dr. Monroe's gentle chords beneath her own. The auditorium, which had only moments before lingered in awkward silence, now leaned forward in collective awe. Parents who had checked their watches were wiping away tears. Neighbors who had whispered, "Poor girl," were nodding in heartfelt admiration. As Grace's piece unfolded its haunting opening, arpeggio growing into a rich tapestry of harmonies, the room transformed. The students backstage poked their heads around the curtains, eyes wide, as though they were glimpsing something sacred. Even the judges, who had earlier scribbled notes with distracted pens, set aside their clipboards and rose to their feet in a spontaneous standing ovation. In that electric moment, Grace herself seemed to change. Her shoulders straightened, her chin lifted, and a shy, radiant smile broke across her face. She played not for pity or polite approval, but out of pure love for her music, her fingers dancing across the keys like they belonged there because they did. Dr. Monroe matched her every phrase with compassionate precision, allowing her original composition to breathe and soar. When they reached the final chord, a sustained, resonant whisper of possibility, the silence that followed was no longer hollow, but reverent. A quiet before the storm of applause that erupted like thunder. Phones darted up to capture the scene, a veteran pianist from Juilliard endorsing a backyard prodigy, a child of modest means, shining brighter than any costume or backing track. After the last echoes faded, Grace turned and offered Dr. Monroe the smallest, most genuine smile, as if to say, "See, I told you I could." He tipped his head in proud acknowledgement, his eyes shining with tears he refused to hide. Back in her seat, Margaret Thompson's hands flew to her mouth, then clasped in her lap, trembling with relief and pride that defied every whispered insult from earlier. In those few minutes of harmonious collaboration, the story of the poor girl was rewritten forever. Grace was not defined by circumstance, but by courage, creativity, and the simple truth that when talent meets kindness, even the quietest voice can fill an auditorium and a lifetime with hope. Margaret Thompson couldn't have imagined that a simple business card would carry so much promise. After Dr. Elias Monroe, renowned Juilliard piano instructor, had elevated her daughter Grace's melody into something transcendent, He approached Margaret in the hallway outside the auditorium, his calm eyes shining with conviction. He slipped a slim, embossed card into Margaret's hand and said quietly, "I work with the Harmonia Youth Arts Foundation in New York. They offer weekend intensives and private mentorship for young composers, no audition required. Your daughter deserves this opportunity, in that moment." The weight of their modest lives seemed to shift. Back home, in their 2-bedroom bungalow on the edge of town, Margaret placed the card on the kitchen table beside the battered $60 keyboard. The very next morning, over bowls of cereal and lukewarm milk, Grace asked, "Do you really think they'll let me go?" Margaret smiled, fighting back tears. She poured them each a cup of hot cocoa American style. With just a hint of cinnamon, and promised, they already said yes. 5 months later. Their Saturday routine looked nothing like it had before. At 6:30 a.m., Margaret would gently shake Grace awake, and they'd pile into the old sedan, Grace clutching her sheet music folder against the passenger door. On the drive to Harmonia's suburban campus, just 60 miles west of town, the cornfield slipped by under a pale sunrise, and Grace would hum new melodies into her recorder. By 8:00 a.m., they'd arrive at the Foundation's Bright Recital Hall, where Grace joined a small cohort of 10 budding composers from across the region. Under the guidance of seasoned mentors, retired symphony conductors, Broadway arrangers, and Grammy-winning producers, Grace learned to refine her harmonies, explore counterpoint, and notate her ideas on real manuscript paper. She discovered how a minor chord could convey sorrow, how dynamics painted emotion, and how form gave structure to her storytelling. Meanwhile, Margaret sat in the hall's side lobby, knitting quietly or chatting with other parents who, like her, juggled blue-collar jobs and college tuition dreams. Over shared coffee, they marveled at their children's progress and swapped tips on balancing work, family, and this precious artistic gift. Grace's transformation was remarkable. Where she once hesitated on stage, now she stood with assurance, introducing her pieces by name and describing the feelings behind each motif. The private mentorship sessions, 3 hours every Sunday, gave her the tools to complete a 15-minute sonata by her 12th birthday. More importantly, the nurturing environment taught her that art thrives on encouragement just as much as on raw talent. At home, their modest living room became a second studio. Grace placed her laptop on a folding table, connecting to her mentors via video call. Margaret learned to adjust the lamp's position for optimal lighting and even mastered a few musical terms: allegro, adagio, crescendo, so she could ask meaningful questions. Their small house bristled with creativity staff papers scattered across the coffee table, a metronome ticking softly on the bookshelf, and Grace's journal full of sketches for future movements. Perhaps the most profound change, though, was in Grace's spirit. She still wore thrift store dresses and secondhand shoes, but she carried herself with a quiet confidence that no longer faltered. And Margaret, who once believed her daughter's talent had to remain hidden beneath humility, now beamed unabashedly at every recital, her heart brimming with pride, all because one stranger chose to hand them that single card, a gesture that transformed an evening of silence into an opening chord for a lifelong symphony. Margaret Thompson hardly knew what to say when Dr. Elias Monroe slipped the embossed business card into her hand. They stood in the narrow hallway just outside the auditorium, its bright lights still humming with the echo of Grace's triumphant duet. "I work with the Harmonia Youth Arts Foundation in New York," he said quietly. "They offer weekend composer intensives and one-on-one mentorship, no audition required. Your daughter deserves this. In that instant, the weight of years spent scraping together babysitting money and yard sale keyboard repairs shifted. The card felt impossibly heavy with promise. Back home that evening, Margaret placed the card beside Grace's battered $60 keyboard, over bowls of chocolate cereal. Grace traced the gold lettering Harmonia Youth Arts Foundation, www.harmoniaarts.org, and http www.moniaarts.org, and asked in a small voice, "Do you think they'll really let me go?" Margaret met her daughter's bright eyes and nodded, her heart full. "They already said yes," she whispered, then folded Grace into a hug that spoke louder than any applause. 5 months later, the Thompson living room had transformed into a miniature music conservatory every Saturday at dawn. They piled into their old sedan for the 60-mile drive to Harmonia's suburban campus. Grace carried her sheet music folder in one hand and a thermos of hot cocoa in the other, while Margaret navigated winding country roads under the pale morning sky. By 9 a.m., Grace was seated at a baby grand in the Foundation's sunlit recital hall, surrounded by 10 other budding composers from across the region. Under the patient guidance of retired symphony conductors and Broadway arrangers, Grace learned to craft counterpoint, orchestrate her melodies for string ensembles, and notate dynamics on authentic manuscript paper. She discovered how a single crescendo could evoke heartbreak, and how a sudden pianissimo could convey whispered secrets. Meanwhile, Margaret sat in the side lobby, knitting quietly and swapping stories with other parents who, like her, balanced moonlit diner shifts with dream-chasing support. Each week, Grace grew more confident. She no longer hesitated on stage. Instead, she introduced her pieces with thoughtful poise and welcomed gentle critique from mentors who recognized her raw talent. Back at their bungalow, the kitchen table was strewn with staff paper and half-finished compositions. Grace recorded new motifs into her smartphone, and Margaret learned musical terms andante, fortissimo, ritardando so she could ask meaningful questions, all because one stranger chose to offer a simple card and a chance. That card became the key that unlocked a world where talent and encouragement collided, proving that with the right support, even the quietest voice can write its own symphony. Margaret Thompson's hands still tingled from the final. Triumphant applause when Grace stepped off the stage and ran straight into her mother's open arms. In that instant, all the hurtful whispers the poor girl. Single mom faded into the background, eclipsed by the sound of genuine cheer. Margaret felt Grace's shoulders shake with silent sobs, and she held her daughter tight, whispering, "You did it. Honey, you did it." Grace buried her face into Margaret's shoulder, as if anchoring herself in the one place she knew was always safe, standing just a few feet away. Dr. Elias Monroe watched the reunion with a satisfied smile. He approached quietly, tipping his head to Margaret before crouching down to Grace's level. Grace's tear-streaked face lit up at his gentle greeting. "Thank you, Dr. Monroe," she whispered, her voice small yet steady. He offered her a reassuring nod and patted her hand before turning to Margaret. In that brief exchange, 2 nods, 2 warm smiles, Margaret understood that her daughter's worth had finally been recognized not by circumstance, but by genuine talent and character. As they walked toward the exit, Margaret couldn't stop looking at Grace's bright eyes. For the first time, her daughter carried herself with confidence rather than caution. the mother-daughter duo navigated past lingering parents and curious students. But Margaret hardly noticed them anymore. All she saw was Grace head held high, steps purposeful, her spirit unburdened. It was as though the hall itself had transformed what had once been a place of judgment, had become a crucible in which Grace's resilience was forged. That evening, back in their cozy living room, Grace placed her well-worn keyboard on her lap and hummed a few bars of a new melody. Margaret caught herself smiling at the simple sight the way Grace's fingers hovered over the keys with newfound certainty. "Play it for me," she said softly. Grace nodded and let the music flow, each note clear and unfaltering. Margaret sat nearby, sipping a mug of hot cocoa she'd prepared, and realized that this was the real encore, not the applause of an audience, but the quiet affirmation that comes from knowing you belong. In the days that followed, Margaret noticed small but precious changes, Grace offering to braid her own hair before school, choosing a sturdier backpack without hesitation, even humming her compositions at the breakfast table. And each morning, as they headed out to their usual routines, Margaret to her janitor's shift at the middle school, Grace to her classroom, she carried with her the echo of that applause and the memory of a single moment when a room full of strangers stood to honor her daughter. It was the reminder that sometimes it takes just one act of recognition to change a life forever, and that every time Grace sat at those keys, she would carry that moment with her, playing not for pity, but for the pure joy of being heard. Life often tests our resolve in moments of silence rather than applause. When 9-year-old Grace Thompson finished her tender piano composition, the auditorium sat in hushed judgment until a single act of kindness transformed the moment. Dr. Elias Monroe, a Juilliard piano instructor, rose from the back row and asked Grace to play again, offering his gentle accompaniment. In that gesture, Grace discovered more than an endorsement of her talent. She found permission to believe in herself. This story reminds us that every one of us, no matter our age, background, or circumstance, deserves to be heard and seen. Whether you're encouraging a grandchild, supporting a longtime friend, or simply reaching out with a kind word, your attention can ignite hope and confidence. It takes just one person to change a life, a nod of recognition, a shared smile, or a listening ear. What small act of kindness has made a difference in your life? Maybe it was a teacher who stayed after class, a neighbor who offered a ride, or a stranger's unexpected compliment. Please share your story in the comments below. Your experience could be the encouragement someone else needs today. And if you believe in celebrating quiet acts of courage and the power of human connection, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories that uplift and inspire. Let's continue to remind each other that no voice is too soft to be heard.